is focused on protecting your digital assets. And our speaker today, or I guess the conversation today will carry forward with Michael Pleasant, who's the CEO of a company called OpenSecurity that's based in San Antonio. They primarily work on cybersecurity related issues. And so he is very well accomplished. He's growing his company and is, I think, a very well-spoken, knowledgeable person, and helps kind of bring down some of the concepts to more understandable terms. And ideally, he'll have some insights based on some of those comments today. So I'd just like to welcome you, Michael. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for giving us your time and being willing to share with the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Ryan. I appreciate it. Honestly, your comments are a little bit too kind, but I appreciate them nonetheless. Like Ryan said, hello, everybody. My name is Michael Pleasant. I am the CEO of a cybersecurity firm based here in San Antonio called OpenSecurity. We have offices across the nation and clients around the world. We've been around for about 6 or 7 years now, about 15 people on the team. And we've grown over the last 7 years from initially just bootstrapping out of our garage to a multinational global sort of cybersecurity firm. So I know exactly what it's like to go from I've just signed up for QuickBooks and I don't know what anything means to I'm managing clients around the world and doing all sorts of different business strategies and those types of things. So I've had that entrepreneurial journey. So I understand what it's like to be at every stage. We are what we call now in the post-revenue stage, where we're now gaining revenue. We're of course growing naturally, but we're no longer sort of in that startup-y phase. We're what I call us in that mature startup post-revenue. So that's where we are. But to bring it back, I think more relevant to some of the different introductions that the different attendees were talking about. What I'll do briefly is kind of just talk about cybersecurity in general today, some of the things that we see and some tips and tricks that might be helpful for you. I'll do that for just a few minutes though, and then I'd like to kind of transition into addressing some of the more IT information technology concerns that some of you have, as opposed to just generically cybersecurity. I think that might be more useful and more helpful to take on some of these other concerns and challenges that some of these other entrepreneurs are going through, and then also kind of tie in some security topics into there. So with that, let me just kind of briefly talk a little bit about cybersecurity. Ultimately, cybersecurity can be a very complicated topic because there are lots of things that can be involved, but very generally, each of you actually kind of were already talking about it, talking about essentially just data security. Each of you understands that you have a business in this day and age where you have data of some kind. Maybe it's compliance data, like HIPAA from Jason, or maybe it's just generic PII or personally identifiable information, like Alejandro said. Regardless of whatever data you have, I think you all kind of understand that it's important to different degrees, and it should be considered part of your business strategy to maintain some kind of security around that. So what can you do? If you already understand that that's a need, you already understand that that's something that's important, what do you do about that? Well, some of the very simple things you can do, I'd say probably the simplest thing you can do is that no matter what platform you're using for file storage or financial data or customer data or even social media, no matter what platform or tools you're using across the internet, two-factor authentication is really the best thing you can do. Two-factor authentication essentially means that you're using a login name or email and password to log into your account. And whenever you do that, instead of getting right to your account, the platform says, okay, great, you gave me a name and a password, but now give me a rotating security code to get in. Some of you may already be familiar with this. Often the way this works is through either a randomly generated number that your phone will give you, or they will email you a verification code, or they'll text you a verification code. But this is what we mean by two-factor. Your first factor is your password and username to a certain extent. And the second factor is this rotating, randomly generated number that only you know. So even if somebody gets your email or username and your password, they still will have a difficult time getting into your accounts if you have two-factor enabled, because when they try to log in, it'll tell them the same thing that it tells you, which is, great, thanks for your username and password. Now give me this temporary randomly generated number that I've either texted you or emailed you or is generated by your phone, and then I'll let you in. And that person who's trying to get in and shouldn't be there often won't have access to that number, only you do. And that two-factor authentication is pretty much the most valuable way you can secure any data today. That's kind of a generic statement, but a lot of studies have come out. Google specifically have said that in their own internal studies, security breaches were reduced by 99% from those accounts that have two-factor authentication enabled. And so that's obviously a huge number. So I can't really overstate the value of that. If you're not already familiar with this, or you're not already using it on your accounts, most platforms today have some two-factor authentication as an option that you can enable or opt into. And I would strongly suggest that you do that. So that's one. Two-factor authentication is definitely a thing. I'm going to talk about three things broadly and then kind of dive into some of your individual challenges. But the three things, the first one is two-factor authentication. The second one is passwords. There's a lot of misinformation and mixed information about passwords and password usage and how to craft a good password. Over the last 10 years, that guidance has shifted quite a bit. 10 years ago, we used to think that long, complex passwords with uppercase and lowercase and numbers and symbols and all this jazz was really good, and that was a good password. And the fact is that it's not at all. In fact, people who generally have those kinds of passwords, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really make your passwords harder to break into. It doesn't make your passwords more secure. It actually does the opposite. Because if a platform is asking you to create a complex password, let's say it asks you to make a 12-character password that is complex, means it has a mixture of numbers and letters and symbols, and let's say you do that, what are the odds that you're going to be able to remember what that was? Not very good statistically, because if you are doing the right thing by having different passwords for different platforms and all of them are complex, ultimately you're going to forget passwords, or you're going to write them down, or you're going to make them the same across different platforms because they're hard to remember. Ultimately, having complex passwords makes the usage of passwords more inconvenient and difficult for you, the end user, which leads to more insecurity. So instead, the new guidance is, instead of doing a mixture, don't worry about that. You don't have to have uppercase and lowercase numbers, and don't do any of that. Instead, there's only one thing you need to do, and that's length. And so we're trying to shift people's understanding of passwords to passphrases. So for example, instead of having your password be the word password with 1, 2, 3 at the end or whatever to make it complex, instead, your password should be a passphrase. So the password instead should be, this is my password, like actually all of those letters. It doesn't matter if they're uppercase, lowercase, or anything, doesn't matter that. But that, don't use that, by the way. This is my password, don't use that. That's an example. But if you were to do that, that passphrase instead of the password is a much better pass code to get into an account. And the reason is length. Ultimately, the complexity is something that can be overcome very quickly with modern computing. But for every character you add onto a password, so we're talking about length here, an 8-character password versus, let's say, a 16 or 20-character password creates entropy, which is essentially however exponentially longer computers or bad actors need to take to break into a password. And so complexity doesn't really matter because it makes it more insecure, because it makes it more inconvenient for you. Instead, have a simple but lengthy passphrase for your platforms, for your accounts. Make sure they're different across your platforms, but do that. So this shift in understanding how complex passwords to simple passphrases is another thing that we are trying in the industry of cybersecurity, trying very hard to get people to understand. Another last sort of footnote about passwords is if you're having trouble creating passwords or passphrases, or remembering passwords or passphrases, having a password manager is very helpful. There are many out there: 1Pass, LastPass, Dashlane. There are a number out there that are just fine. Each of them are a little bit different in their own ways and their own sort of look and feel, but ultimately they all kind of do the same thing. If you're having a lot of passwords or passphrases or having trouble managing them, having a password manager like those, LastPass, Dashlane, 1Pass, and there's others, those are great tools to have for passwords. So the first thing we talked about was two-factor authentication, cannot be overstated. Second thing is an understanding from passwords, complex passwords, to simple passphrases and the value of a password manager. And the third thing is, I forget the phrase now, it doesn't come to me, but essentially it's rules of least privileges, access of least privileges. And basically what that means is you have, as owners of businesses, you have access to customer data. You may not be working with a large team today, but over the course of time, you might grow that team and grow the people with whom you work, who might or might not need access to data. And over the course of time, the amount of data that you have access to will probably grow. And so while the growth of your team and growth of your data continues over time, when it comes to data security, the question you should be asking yourself is, who has access to that data and who should have access to that data? Not everybody in your team needs access to all of the data. Some people might need some access to some of the data and some others may not. And so as your team and as your data grows, being able to segment permissions and segment access to different portions of different data to different roles in your team, being able to do that is incredibly important to ensure that any kind of leakages or breakages or access violations or anything of that sort can be dealt with in a way that is not as catastrophic to your business if they're segmented properly. And so, again, the question to ask yourself as you grow over time really is, of all the data that I have, who has access to what? Do they need it? Maybe they only need it temporarily. And you make sure that you or somebody on your team is managing that kind of thing. Larger institutions will have security information officers or information security officers and other roles that are similar to that. And that's the kind of questions they ask themselves is, as somebody who is in a leadership position of my business, I understand the wealth of data that we've collected, but who has access to what? In a large organization, the CEO himself or herself probably doesn't have access to all of the data, and nor should they. Why should the CEO have access to absolutely everything? That's a security concern. That's a vulnerability, because that is what we call a single point of failure. If somebody were to break into the CEO's access, well, now they have everything, and that would be obviously catastrophic. And on a day-to-day basis, the CEO probably doesn't need access to all of the data all of the time. He or she needs certain amounts of data at given time periods for different decision making. And so being able to segment is important. So while some of you might be in the earlier stages of your business, and this isn't a larger concern right now, as you grow in your social media and you start sharing your social media credentials to marketing firms, or as you bring on accountants to have access to your QuickBooks, making sure they don't necessarily have access to everything if they don't need it, or do when they do, those kinds of questions. So as you think about your business and you think about the security of your business and the data within your business, the three really major things that you can do today are two-factor authentication, switching from complex passwords to simple but longer passphrases, using a password manager if that's helpful for you, and then understanding segmentation of access and segmentation of data and access to those segments of data. Those are the three kind of big major things you can do. So rather than drone on forever about other cybersecurity things, because we could really just spend all day doing that. And while I think that's exciting, I'm sure many people don't necessarily. Those three things are really valuable. And so now I'll kind of transition from just the big kind of tips and tricks like that to some of your other challenges. But before I do, anybody listening here, do you have any questions about some of those things that I said, or specifically about cybersecurity? Are there any initial questions or initial concerns that you think you might want to chat about? I'll go ahead and step in and say, I know I heard Jason earlier talk about HIPAA concerns. For those who are unfamiliar, HIPAA is a compliance standard for health data. Basically, it says if a company or if anybody really has or collects any kind of medical data or health data, I'm using generic terms, but medical or health data for a patient or an individual, that data is specifically covered by the HIPAA compliance standard and must be treated differently than other data. And so there are specific rules and regulations that Jason has to do and has to follow and be in compliance with for that data. Another example of compliance is something called PCI, and that's for payment information. So if for some reason you collect payment information, that's a credit card number or something of that effect, that is PCI compliance data, and you have to do specific things to that data. And so while some of you may not have to deal with this today, another question to ask yourself when it comes to just making sure that you're within your bounds and you're making sure that you are operating, within the legalities that you should be, and also for data security and privacy. Ask yourself if at any point in time, do you think your business is or has collected data that may be considered special by either the state government or federal government or some regulatory agency. Today, payment information is usually handled by a third party, so it's typically not a problem that smaller businesses have to deal with. But it's a good practice to have when it comes to just information management over the course of time, is just to ask yourself, hey, let me just look at all the data that we have. Let me think about all the data that we may have collected, either intentionally or accidentally. Is this data we need to hold on to? Is this data that we can actually delete and get rid of because we don't need it and there's no reason to have it? And if something bad were to happen, that would just be more leakage, right? Not holding on to data you don't need is a good practice in and of itself too. So and just asking yourself and doing kind of a data audit, either for compliance reasons or just general housekeeping, is also a good idea. And so I heard Ray earlier talk about file sharing with clients, and Alejandra too kind of spoke to this a little bit about data security. If you're using any kind of email system, so for example, I know Ray said he used Outlook and he used the Microsoft ecosystem, which is great. I'm a fan of what Microsoft's done over the last few years. One of the things that you can do is ensure that your emails are encrypted. If you're concerned that the information that you're sharing with clients via email is sensitive or is data that should have additional layers of protection on it, make sure that email is encrypted. And so I would encourage you to do a quick Google search and Google something like Microsoft Outlook email encryption and learn all of the different tools and different ways in which Outlook gives you the ability to encrypt email traffic. That way, emails that are after you've sent an email, theoretically, nobody along the way can see them or read them, and only the person to whom they're supposed to go to can actually read them, because if anybody theoretically intercepts an encrypted email, they hopefully wouldn't be able to read it. So email traffic being encrypted is one thing. Data security, like Alejandra said, how does she ensure that stuff is protected? Again, if it's stored somewhere like a Dropbox, or OneDrive or Google Drive, just ensure that your account is protected through two-factor and good password management. But also, again, maybe ask yourself about the data you're collecting. Do you need it? Is it really important? If that data were to unfortunately leak, who's liable for that information? So for example, if I wrote down some kind of sensitive information and I handed it over on that piece of paper to Alejandra, and Alejandra lost that piece of paper, well, Alejandra is liable for that if it was sensitive and protected information. But for example, if let's say Alejandra is using QuickBooks to collect information, right? And it's not her account that gets compromised, it's something on the QuickBooks end that gets compromised. Well, then the liability isn't on her, it's on QuickBooks. But on the opposite end, if it's her account that gets compromised, then it's her fault, not QuickBooks. And so ensuring that the platforms you're using are secure, ensuring that you are using their security features like two-factor is important. And then ensuring that the platforms that you're using are within compliance or have ability to deal with compliance like HIPAA or PCI is important. And typically platforms like Shopify will tell you very explicitly what they do for PCI or what they do for HIPAA. If they do anything at all, they may or may not. And so those kinds of questions are good to ask up front. And you can even contact them. If you can't find it easily, they have a whole customer service for a reason. And it's specifically to give you the best kind of experience you can to be successful on their platform. So if you don't know if your platforms are HIPAA or PCI compliant or whatever else, just ask them. Those are great questions to ask. And in fact, you can even ask them for their policies and have them on file. So if anybody comes to you and says, what are you doing about data security? Or what are you doing about PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance? You can say, well, we use this platform and here is their policy where we store the data. Ergo, it's our policy. So you can have an answer to some of those questions if they're ever asked of you. And so those are just some food for thought from some of the comments and things that I was hearing from the listeners earlier.
I have a question for you, Michael.
Yeah, Ryan.
So, and I won't name names into what company this was, but I recently was renewing or updating my payment information with a vendor, and they sent me the form, which was just simply a Microsoft Word document that asked me to input my credit card information, and lo and behold, I opened the form and someone else's like inputted credit card information is on that form, right? So that's a bad process, obviously. Like that, I shouldn't have seen that, but I was nice enough to say like, hey, you sent me this, it's already filled out, I'm gonna delete it, but just FYI, that's what's up. So do you have recommendations for like building processes like that, or I don't know, tools, or like, how do you, like, should all of that be handled in some sort of like singular system, or, I don't know. Does that make sense? Like, am I clear?
Yeah. No, you bring up a good point, which is when it comes to data security and the way in which your business handles data privacy or data security, you can never be too cautious. You can never be too careful. And so as you are developing the processes and as you are collecting that information, if your gut tells you, hey, I don't know about this. Can we do this? Are we sure we can do this? Are we doing this the right way? What should we do if something goes wrong, et cetera? Those are great questions to ask. And so one of the things that I recommend is having somebody that you can ask those questions to, whether it's either legal advice, having any kind of legal representation or legal counsel you can ask, or having somebody in the IT or cybersecurity field to ask. We have clients all the time who call us and simply ask those questions like, hey, we're rolling out this new product, and in the rollout, we want to collect this information from our customers. Here's how we intend to do it. What do you think? And so we'll come back and we'll look at that process and say, this is great, or this isn't so great, and here's why. And so you as your business, as a business owner, if you're looking to collect data or you're looking to manage data and you don't have somebody for whom you can go to and ask, hey, is this okay? What do you think about this? And get a second opinion, a second expert opinion. I would definitely try and go get that person. LaunchSA is a good resource connector for that. So if you don't already have a connection for that, definitely hit up Ryan, hit up the different resources through LaunchSA and say, I'm looking for an IT resource for this, or I'm looking for a cybersecurity for that. Because having those kinds of resources and having those kinds of people to ask those questions to is definitely very, very important to building those things. And equally for yourself, if you come across a process like Ryan just described, where somebody's asking you for your information and you pull up a weird looking form and you get a weird feeling, you're like, I don't know why, but I don't really trust this. Trust your instincts and trust your gut. Don't just offer information to anybody anywhere on the internet. That should be rule number one. And if you do have a concern about something, contact them and ask them and just tell them, be like, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't know why, but I get a bad feeling. Do you have a different way to do it? And if they're accommodating and if they are understanding of your concern, then that's an indication that may be somebody you want to do business with. But if they're not, then maybe it's not. Because even if their business is well-intentioned and legitimate, if they don't really understand or care or have the empathy for your concerns about data privacy and security, what else do they have that sort of laissez-faire attitude about? And so I would just kind of take that into consideration. So the short answer to your question, Ryan, is definitely trust your gut. If you feel that something is not trustworthy or you shouldn't offer your information to somewhere, don't. Just default to not sharing. And then in your own business and in business processes, if you're unsure, have somebody to ask.
Great, thank you. And then I guess sort of like to the second part of that question, like, do you recommend having sort of long intakes or short intakes, or, like, should I not send out stuff with, like, just through Microsoft Word? Should it be through, some sort of direct pay link, or do you maybe know of irrelevant questions that are asked commonly that maybe, too much information, like, hey, maybe I don't need your zip code or something? I don't know. It's kind of a lot of questions. So.
Yeah, no, I understand. But essentially what you're asking is, you can spend all day collecting information. Should you, right? What information is really pertinent? What information isn't? And really what that comes down to is, of all the information you could possibly collect, if you had access to all that information, what scares you the most about losing? So let's pretend that you are about to send a Word document out to a client, and that Word document asks them a bunch of questions, a whole bunch of questions. And let's say you got that Word document back, and that Word document contained answers to all of those questions. Of all those questions, if a bad actor, if somebody nefarious, if somebody bad got a hold of that Word document the next day, of everything in that document, what question or what piece of information scares you the most about getting out of your hands, that you now have to go back to that client and say, hey, just so you know, this information that you gave me in confidence is now public. It's now out there and I can't control it, and there's nothing we can do about it. Which of those questions scares you the most? And I'm sure you can probably point to one or more things on, let's say, a document as this sort of metaphorical document like that. And if those things scare you, first of all, good. Second of all, what do you do about it? A, do you need to ask it at all? Is it really important for you to have in writing? Do you need to collect it? Do you need to archive it? Do you need to have it on record? And then if you do, and sometimes you do, then okay, then what are you doing to safeguard that data? What are you doing to ensure, as best as you possibly can, that a bad actor doesn't get access to that data tomorrow? And if you can only point to one thing or two things, or you're not really sure what your overall security plan is for that data that you're afraid of losing, then that means that before you collect the data, you probably need, as best as you can, to reinforce or build those security processes first so that you can collect that data. And I heard several of you discuss things like OneDrive and Dropbox and Google Drive and those types of data storage solutions. Those are all great. No one is better necessarily than the other. They all tout various levels of encryption and data security and data in transit and data at rest and all these other types of things. They're all generally fine. Ultimately, what it comes down to, though, is not so much are these platforms that store data good or bad. What it comes down to is, what are you doing to ensure that the level of access to the data on these platforms is secure, and that your access to that data is secure? Because again, the odds of, let's say, Dropbox getting hacked, very low. That's probably not going to happen. But the odds of your account, which has access to that data, getting hacked is higher than Dropbox itself just getting hacked. And so you can mitigate that by having only a few people having access, right? The least amount of people possible having two-factor authentication be enabled and be required for everybody else, having longer passwords, again, going back to that sort of passphrase to make longer passwords easier, having password managers. Yeah, really that kind of business process exercise, that sort of the mind experiment, right? Of if I were able to collect any data from customers, of that data, what would be scariest for me to have to go back to that client and say we lost it? And then what are you doing? You know, do you have to collect it? Do you not? Do you have to record it? Do you not? What am I doing to protect it? You know, those types of things. Just kind of going through those motions and asking yourself those kinds of questions periodically over the course of the growth of your business. Those are good exercises to have individually and then with your team as it grows.
Great, thank you. I have one other probably last question for me, and it sounds like based on the insights that you're providing, it sounds like maybe the, call it, weakest link in the chain tends to be people, right? So like taking it back from, you know, the digital assets component, like if I have a physical place, like, you know, so that things don't get stolen online, is it just better to have physical copies, or should I just upload them all to the cloud, or you know, like, I guess, you know, should I be more worried that somebody gets me online, or somebody, you know, walks in and steals my filing cabinet? I don't know if does that make sense? I'm kind of
No, it does.
volleying into
Yeah, no, and the short answer really is it comes down to the type of data, and a lot of the same principles that we've been talking about for the digital space of cybersecurity can apply to physical security too. So it's, you know, when we talk about how many people have access to data online, the same thing can be said for physical access. How many people have a key to the office? Or how many people know the code to the safe in the back, or whatever, right? Those same types of questions, those same types of exercises and principles can be applied physically too. Of all the paper data we have in the office, how much of this really needs to stay here? How much can we shred or burn? Do we need to record everything of what we have in the office? You know, if one piece were to go missing, what is the scariest piece in the office to go missing? And then again, what are we doing to secure that? And who has access to it? Again, all of those same types of things apply. But when it comes to deciding between a digital or physical space, it really depends on your business. So for us, for example, in cybersecurity, we retain client data for as absolutely little time as possible, because any data that we have about a client vulnerability, we want to give that client, we want to obviously inform them about that vulnerability and give them all the information we have about how we found it and what it means and what they can do about it. But us ourselves, as far as an archive goes, we absolutely do not want to archive that stuff anywhere for any reason. And so we have a policy of information purge. After a given amount of time, after an engagement has completed, we will completely erase all of that client data, because it's not ours to hold, it's not ours to record or have. And so that's one way that we mitigate that. Some other data, though, that isn't necessarily client related, it's more our business related, that we don't necessarily want to have easily accessible online, again, going back to that sort of segmentation practice, is something that we will pull down. We'll make a copy of it on a thumb drive or an external hard drive, in what we call cold storage or air gap storage, where that data is no longer stored anywhere online, any kind of cloud platform. Instead, it is air gapped, meaning it's not connected to the internet whatsoever. It's in cold storage. So if we needed it, we can go access it. And we have physical mitigations for keeping that stuff secure. But that's mostly just our own business practices. And those are mostly just our own business information that we collect over time. It has nothing to do with client data. And so, again, depending on data, as you can see from my example, we've compartmentalized. This is our business internal data, and this is how we deal with it. This is client data, and this is how we deal with it. And so thinking back to your own data, segmentation of data, segmentation of access to that data, either physically or digitally, all of those types of exercises definitely apply. And if after having spoken for the last 45 minutes, if all of this sounds like a whole lot to take on, it's really not. But it can certainly help to have either experts or have other consultants or other people in the field, such as myself or our firm, help walk you through that. We do that often for a lot of clients. Clients, sometimes they come to us with specific needs or challenges that need to be overcome. But other times we have clients who come to us, especially smaller businesses, who come to us and say, hey, we've been in business for a few years. We have this amount of data, and we have these concerns, and we're not really sure how to walk through thinking about all of the cybersecurity concerns or just information security concerns that we might need to think through. Help us walk through that. And so the conversation that you and I have had today here is really kind of similar to the same conversation that we have with the clients as we walk through, okay, tell us about the data that you have, tell us about any kind of compliance, tell us about who has access and who doesn't, how do you segment, or do you segment? We kind of just walk through all of these different kinds of exercises and steps, ultimately arriving at, okay, great, here are the things you're doing well, here are some of the things that you can work on or improve, and then we'll come back periodically and say, let's do a quick audit, let's see what you've improved, let's see what you've done, let's see how your situation has changed, and help kind of walk them through that. And internally for larger organizations, that's exactly the type of exercise and the type of activities that an information security officer or somebody similar to that kind of role will do for a business internally, is do those kinds of things to themselves. So I've been talking for about, 40, 45 minutes or so on just kind of just general cybersecurity, as well as some of the challenges that I heard some of the listeners today talk about. As we kind of wrap up, are there any other questions? Is there any other kind of Q&A? Is there anything other? This is kind of an opportunity for you to pick the brain of a nerd if you'd like to. So is there any other things that I can answer for you?
Hi, Michael.
Hey, Ray, how are you?
All right. Hey, you mentioned password management.
Yep.
And do you know of any, which one is much better than the other? I used to use Dashlane. I can't remember. I think I was just having a lot of trouble with it. And I moved over to Keeper Security.
Okay.
But it's pretty good. I mean, I don't really have too many complaints, but just kind of see what's out there that may be better or more secure than another.
Yeah, ultimately, when it comes to password managers, it really just comes down to which is easiest for you to use. For the most part, they're pretty much the same in terms of security and trustworthiness and price and those types of things. So Dashlane is great, but if you didn't like the interface and just using it was cumbersome for you in the past, that's fine. That's a very subjective thing. Everybody's experience will be different. So Dashlane is one. LastPass is another. OnePass, I think, is another. But there are several others. But those are kind of the three that we often just recommend because those are the biggest ones, and those are the ones that people like the most. So Dashlane, LastPass, and I think it's OnePass. I think might be the other, or OnePassword. I don't remember off the top of my head now. But those are some other ones for you to think about. For our company, we've chosen to use LastPass, but that's again subjectively simply because we like using it. But some of my engineers prefer Dashlane for other reasons, so it's kind of a subjective thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions?
Jason or Alejandra?
No, I don't have any questions for now. Thank you.
I think I'm good. I'm going to probably look into some of the password manager things.
Great. Thank you so much. Michael, do you have anything else that you think would be valuable in terms of security process or anything?
Yeah, ultimately, I think just kind of a closing remarks. There's inevitably always something in the news about cybersecurity. And generally, if it's on the news, it's made to make you either afraid or angry or something to that effect. whenever you see something like that, if something like that concerns you specifically about your business, I would just encourage you to have somebody to reach out to have a conversation about that. And Launch SA is a perfect starting point for those kinds of conversations, because Launch SA inevitably is connected to any number of resources, either academic or professional, to help you have those kinds of conversations and help you think through those things, either free resources or otherwise. So if you do have any concerns along the way, I would definitely reach back out to Launch SA to initiate some of those conversations. But cybersecurity doesn't have to be hard. They can be simple. Like I said, the three kind of major easy steps that you can do immediately to make yourself immensely more secure are two-factor authentication, simple but long passphrases, and a password manager as well, and then thinking about data and access segmentation. Those are three, I'll say, easy steps to kind of do that. But just as kind of closing, if you do have any other questions for either myself or want to get into contact with our firm is called OpenSecurity. You can find us at opensecurity.com. You can contact us there, and anybody else on the team. I'm also on Twitter if you want to get to me. My handle is my last name. It's Pleasant, PLEASANTML. That's my handle on Twitter. But yeah, absolutely. If you have any other questions or want to get a hold of us and just have a conversation, by all means, reach out, let us know. And otherwise, thank you for your time. I appreciate you listening. Thanks for participating in Launch SA's activities. We're a huge supporter of Launch SA. We think it's great here in San Antonio. I think it's one of the things that sets the San Antonio entrepreneurial community apart from others is Launch SA and that sort of tight-knit community that they develop. And so we're happy to be part of it.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I know that there's definite value in everything that you've provided today. And thank you for allowing us to stream and record it as well, so we can provide this at a later date to anybody else that's kind of interested in getting some good initial strategy and tips. So thank you all for participating. Thank you, Michael, again. I'm going to go ahead and close the session, and we will see you hopefully at another session.